And what I was reading was the claim that this was really unprecedented. So then the question was, well, if it is unprecedented, in what respect is it unprecedented? There's another group of people who were arguing that, well, it's not really unprecedented because if you look at, let's say, the influenza epidemic of 1918, which carried on for several years, nicknamed the Spanish flu, that the influenza epidemic, in fact, had actually caused enormous mortality in comparison with which COVID-19, the coronavirus problem, seemed minuscule in comparison with that. The question was the migrant crisis. And here I think there is another answer. And that answer is that we're really speaking about a government in India where people who run the government, we're not naming names, but we're just saying in general, the general outlook of this government, this is not a government of people who are educated, frankly, because who is responsible? Is it China? Is it WHO? Well, I think China definitely has some role to play. That's my own view of the matter. But that's, I've put it some role to play. Meaning here that I think it is quite likely that the virus actually did originate in China. I think it's a zoonotic disease. But look, why did it happen? We'll have to understand that to answer your question. Because what's happening is human beings are increasingly encroaching upon natural preserves. Okay? Now, if that's the case, then the world bears responsibility. It is our lifestyles. It's our modern lifestyles. It's the levels of consumption that we all want, right?
Namaste. I, Mithilesh and Sumit, welcome you all to a new episode of the Eastern Report. Today we have with us noted historian Sri Vinay Lal. Welcome, Vinay.
Thank you.
The world as we knew it has changed, and the fury of COVID-19 has unleashed new forces, leaving us with an uncertain future. Though its fatality rate in comparison with some previous epidemics such as Black Death and Spanish flu of 1918-20 is strikingly low, and though it follows in the path of epidemics such as HIV, SARS, and Ebola, the coronavirus pandemic has produced outcomes which are altogether unprecedented. So far, close to 210 million cases, 4.4 million deaths reported globally. In India, so far 32 million cases and 430,000 deaths are reported. The economic impact of the outbreak has been shattering. Investigating all these trends and the social, cultural, political, and philosophical aspects and implications of pandemic, the fury of COVID-19, the book evaluates all. Vinay Lal is a cultural critic, blogger, public commentator, professor of history at UCLA. His 17 authored and edited books include The Empire of Knowledge, The History of History, Political Hinduism, etc. His intellectual interests include Indian history, global politics, historiography, popular culture, cinema, Gandhi, and politics of knowledge systems. He blogs at binaylal.wordpress.com and avplife.in and has a scholarly YouTube channel at youtube/dillichalo. Today, we will discuss Binay's book, The Fury of COVID-19, The Politics, Histories, and Unrequited Love of the Coronavirus. So, Binay, how did The Fury of COVID-19, the book, happen?
Um, the as you're aware, the first uh, cases were really being reported in the early part of last year. It was really around February that I think some people, a minority of people, very small number of people, started becoming aware of something that was going on. And actually, it wasn't. I mean, it was the lockdown in Wuhan, which was in late January of last year. But then it was in the American press, for example, what was reported just as widely was what was happening on the cruise ship. You remember there was a cruise ship where people had come down with COVID-19, and then the question was what to do with the cruise ship. Do you allow it to land? And the passengers were not being allowed to disembark. Well, then suddenly by early March, things started to uh, you know the cases started to grow, and exponentially almost, uh, not as much as they would, of course, in the weeks ahead. And then it was in the middle of March that the university where I teach uh, announced, I think it was March 12th exactly, at UCLA, that everything would be done online. Now, that was clearly a sign, and there were signs coming from the rest of the world that something was happening, which was not within the living memory of almost anyone. Uh, and then, as the cases started to escalate, moving into late March and April, and I won't describe everything because partly it's described in the book. There are thousands of places where I can read about it. What was happening in Italy, for example, and then in Spain, and then eventually countries such as the United States and India, and of course in our own country in India, the Prime Minister, with 4 hours' notice, imposed a lockdown. So, for me, as a cultural historian, and someone who's interested in contemporary global history as well, the question here was, well, how does one start thinking about this? And what I was reading was the claim that this was really unprecedented. So then the question was, well, if it is unprecedented, in what respect is it unprecedented? There's another group of people who were arguing that, well, it's not really unprecedented because if you look at, let's say, the influenza epidemic of 1918, which carried on for several years, nicknamed the Spanish flu, that the influenza epidemic, in fact, had actually caused enormous mortality in comparison with which COVID-19, the coronavirus problem, seemed minuscule in comparison with that. At, let's say, back even in late March, even in April. Uh, and we also have to keep in mind, by the way, that the revised estimate of how many people were killed by the influenza epidemic, the Spanish flu of 1918-20, today the revised estimate is between 50 to 100 million globally. Let's not forget that the population of the world at that time was approximately one fourth of what it is today. So even if we take the lower end, let's say 50 million out of 2 billion, that's an enormous mortality. That's more than the number of people who were killed in World War One. All right. So uh, if you go by that, uh, if you go by that kind of comparison, then one might say that, well, there's nothing unprecedented. But that was not the way I was looking at it, because what appeared to me odd, distinctive, was the fact that everything was shut down, right? That somehow the countries had, whether you're an authoritarian state, a democratic state, a monarchy, whether you're politically conservative, somewhat centrist, it didn't matter what kind of political system you had. It seemed that all countries had more or less come to an understanding that they had to actually shut down their countries. So this is what I started exploring. Um, And then I found that 1956 and 1960s, mid 1960s, we have what is called the Asian flu and the Hong Kong flu. I have discussed both of these very briefly in my book. Both in the 1950s, 1960s, these epidemics caused at least 1 million deaths. At least 1 million. Now remember that uh, it took it took over 6 months for the world to reach 1 million deaths with the present coronavirus pandemic. Okay. And things had already been shut down for months. Now, interestingly, in the 50s and 60s, nothing was shut down. I could find no trace that anything had been shut down. And even during the Spanish flu of 1918-20, different cities took different decisions. Some cities decided to shut down things. For example, in the United States, there's a fair bit of work that we have. Okay. It is very clear that some cities decided to shut down partially. Some cities carried on as though nothing had happened. So this seemed to me to be the most unusual feature of the present coronavirus pandemic. And that is what really prompted the book. In a very narrow sense, that's the answer to your question. The broader answer to your question is when something like this happens, what, if anything, changes in human experience? Okay, in the understanding of certain phenomena. For example, what is the most fundamental issue before us today? And I would say that the most fundamental issue, which dwarfs almost everything else, is climate change. All right. So therefore, for someone like me, the question became, since we are in the midst of this pandemic, will it be an occasion for us to rethink what our priorities are? What is the nature of human experience? What is the place of ethics? How do we become more responsible human beings? So, for example, when things are shut down, consumption levels are going to go down. You know that everywhere in the world, there were reports that there was a lot less pollution because there were no cars on the road. In India, it was reported that people could see the Himalayas from their hometown 200, let's say 50 kilometers away, which they'd never been able to see before because the sky was never clear enough. Never, right? All kinds of stories of this sort were coming out. So, therefore, this book was occasioned by the real answer to your question. It was really occasioned by a set of reflections on the human conditions in times of extreme distress. Yeah.
Yep. So I would like to show the beautiful cover and book to my audience. It's like a thoroughly written, the well-researched book. So like lot of things, like more than 90% things, even I was not knowing, being the history student. So it was quite interesting for me, and I would suggest all the audience watching this to go and have a read. As you wrote in your book, 1911 census, at least 4% of the population died due to epidemics in India. Around 9.15 lakh people died alone in central provinces. What was the reason of such a high mortality rate? Is it the colonial government apathy or abject poverty of India?
Well, the abject poverty itself was a condition of colonial rule. Okay, I mean, there is actually hardly anyone except a few professional historians know this, but in 1870, in 1870, I think it was a journal of the Statistical Society of Great Britain, okay, and Ireland. If my memory serves me correctly, they published a report in 1870 admitting that the severity and frequency of famines in the 19th century in India had never been witnessed in the history of India before. Okay. Now, I want to take a few minutes to properly answer this question because we need to understand several things. One, we need to understand that, and really not just understand it in the academic sense, but digest this horrendous fact, namely that India was racked by famines, especially in the second half of the 19th century, on a scale which has never been witnessed really in, in the history of India, or indeed anywhere in the world, until it was eclipsed by what happened in places such as China, during the Great Leap Forward, as it's called, when the Chinese Communist Party essentially allowed millions of people to die. They knew exactly what was happening. Reports were being sent, but the Chinese Communist Party essentially allowed people to die, and it's estimated that 35, 40 million people may have died. And then, of course, you have the famines in Russia, beginning shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, 1921, 22, and then under Stalin, horrendous deaths. Okay, so think about what I'm saying here. One, that there is an instinctive way, and people have been brought up to believe that as we move along in time, as we get into the 19th century, 20th century, and now in our own time, we progress. This is a narrative that has been given. What we're finding is that famines are far more severe, far more frequent, brutal in the 20th century than they were before. So, what is the specific link between modernity and famines? And this is not how people have been sort of, so to speak, educated to think about it, because think, oh, famines happen, in pre-modern regimes. When you increase food production, you're not going to have problems like that. That's what a common sense reading is. It's completely incorrect, really, frankly. Okay, so that's one element of the story. Now, you started with the statistic which I mentioned as well, which is you look at the demographic consequences of it as reflected in the census of India. Okay, because there were enormous demographic consequences, obviously. See, from 1870 to 1920 is what I call the half century of catastrophic death in India, where, and I'm not the first person to have looked into this, there are others who have done it, and I have some citations. Um, in that period, I would estimate at a conservatively, that at least 100 million excess deaths took place in India. 100 million excess deaths. Now, some of these are from epidemics. Okay, a good number of these deaths are from famines, somewhere in the vicinity of 20 to 30 million at least. Some are from epidemics, and now we're talking about malaria, cholera, tuberculosis. Um, and of course, we're talking about long term deaths from malnutrition, right? And then we're talking about such things as, let's say, the bubonic plague, which comes to Bombay in 1896. And then eventually sweeps through large parts of the Punjab. We have some amount of data from that, and then of course the influenza epidemic of 1918. If you include all of that, we're talking about 100 million excess deaths. So excess deaths is that is at whatever the mortality rate might be in ordinary circumstances. This is beyond the ordinary mortality rate. So the coronavirus deaths that we have are excess deaths. And as you are aware, it has been argued that in India, some of the returns are already showing that the excess deaths are far beyond what the government has admitted. So that it's possible that the actual number of deaths from coronavirus um, pandemic in India are possibly 5 times, maybe even more, than what has been reported. But this is the key thing. What was the role of the colonial state? You see, right? What was the role of the colonial state? And there is a relationship between famines and epidemics too, which people need to get a grip on. And that link in the very first instance is that when you have conditions of starvation, when you have deprivation of food, and the deprivation of food, as Amartya Sen had argued vociferously, eloquently, and persuasively in his majestic work on famines. That what did he argue? He argued that famines take place not because, really fundamentally, because of the shortage of food. It is because people don't have access to food. Okay, they don't have access. I'm putting it in the simplest terms. Right now, why don't they have access? So let's go back now to the late 19th century. What was the colonial policy? So the colonial policy was essentially one of laissez-faire. Laissez-faire. That is, effectively, of course, this is the dogma of capitalism here, but it was basically a policy of state non-intervention, right? That the free market, okay, let it stand. The free market will determine the best outcome over here, okay. Um, and so this is and you can see this. You can see this in the letters of someone like Sir Richard Temple, who was the governor of the Bombay Presidency, right? And you can see this in the letters that he writes to colleagues. You can see that in the famine policies of the state. Okay, so what we're saying here is that it was not just bad government or poor governance, right? Because again, you can have as it were poor governance, and that is undoubtedly a part of the story. Nor am I saying, by the way, that we should say that there was a deliberate plan. I'm not arguing anything of that kind. I don't think that that's how one should think. To eliminate people, to say, okay, let's get rid of the excess population. What I'm saying is the following. Number one, the colonial state fundamentally had no responsibility towards its subjects. It had no responsibility towards its subjects. Okay, and you see this very clearly in the policies of the colonial state at the time of famine and immiseration. Right, that is extreme poverty. And I was saying I didn't develop that point that there is a relationship between famine and starvation on the one hand, and uh, epidemic deaths, because see, people become more vulnerable when they're starving, when they're malnutrition, and this is happening over a period of 1, 2, 3 generations, right? It is those who have already been deprived of food who are going to become more vulnerable during the time of the epidemic. Right? So that's where you see also the relationship, and this is something that becomes very evident during the course of um, the work that was done even back then. That the equivalent of the social worker as such didn't really exist at that time. Uh, but the equivalent of the social worker, let's say someone who's going from door to door trying to gather data, right? They were able to determine, and the report of the Indian Plague Commission shows this very clearly, that many of the people who succumbed to epidemic disease, okay, and to plague were those who were already weakened by the lack of food, those who had been starving for years, had been severely malnourished. Of course, the plague can strike anyone, but we're just saying the probability of death is higher for someone who's already vulnerable, right? So, going back then and wrapping it up, I'm saying that number one, it becomes very clear that the colonial state did not really have any responsibility towards its subjects. It's very clear. Right? That is what it means to be living under a colonial state. All right. Secondly, there was an ideology at work. And that ideology, and to say that there was an ideology at work is to say that the decision was an ideological decision, right? And this ideology was laissez-faire, right? The free market economy. That this will actually resolve our issues when you have, a famine and you're thinking about food distribution. Well, should we send supplies from one place to another, etc. Right? That was a fundamental uh, uh, problem that one has to be alert to. And then, of course, there's a third issue. That's a much wider issue, and that goes back to the kinds of arguments that were made by people like Dadabhai Naoroji and Ramesh Chandra Dutt. Both of them wrote key works pretty much around the same time, 1902 and 1901. So you have a book by Ramesh Chandra Dutt, and this book is The Economic History of India. And then you have a book by Dadabhai Naoroji, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. So if you take these books together, what does Ramesh Chandra Dutt argue? He argues that in fact, India was a great manufacturing and agricultural country, and that British policies pauperized India, deindustrialized. And then, of course, Dadabhai is Naroji is the one who comes up with what is known as the drain theory, that India was drained of its wealth, and then he gives you a very concrete uh, a very concrete set of explanations of how this actually occurred, right? So, if you're looking at the question of poverty, you're looking at the question of um, catastrophic demographic consequences, we'd have to see how Britain eventually bled India and drained it of its wealth and made the people much more vulnerable to such things as famines and epidemic disease.
You have comprehensively described the colonial time epidemic in India. Do we have any evidence for the same for Mughal period or pre-Mughal period?
Do we have evidence for famines, for example, and poverty in Mughal India? What
No, epidemics. I'm saying pandemic,
epidemic?
epidemic. Yes.
Yes. Do we have evidence for that? Well, I mean, actually, look, we have scattered evidence for what we would call epidemic disease, because epidemic disease, these what you are hearing about today. All right, let me begin with this. What you're hearing about today, the second wave, the third wave, right? Where this has all become part of our common vocabulary. You would agree, right?
Yes.
Everyone talks about the second wave, the coming third wave. Some countries they're possibly already thinking about the fourth wave. Well, you see, this influenza epidemic of 1918, right? That's when it started. That's not when it ended. There are reports in the Times of India, which I cite in my book, okay? And same thing with the bubonic plague of 1896. There are reports of it continuing for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Now, for someone who does a history of medicine, a cholera epidemic can last over 50 years easily. 50 years. There may be only remnants of it in some place, minor, tiny remnants, but it's the same so called wave, okay, that came on in full force in a place, let's say 50 years ago. It can last that long. That takes me, therefore, to your question. Because if you look at something like, let's say, the Black Death, right, which I discussed briefly and on which there is a substantial literature, I think on all these subjects, the literature is now going to grow exponentially because of the coronavirus pandemic. Right? I think a lot more people are going to be turning back to the Black Death. They're going to be turning back to the plague that strikes Europe in the 1600s at the time that Samuel Pepys was writing. Right? Um, each of these lasted sometimes for years. So going back to your question specifically about pre-colonial India,
Right.
what evidence do we have from Mughal India and maybe even earlier on? Well, I'd say even earlier on, we don't really have much evidence. We certainly see references in Mughal literature to an epidemic outbreak of epidemic disease. Uh, but one thing we have to understand is that there was very little understanding of these matters. So when you had calamitous death, um, you see, if it's something like, let's say, chicken pox, okay, or a smallpox, the smallpox was the real fear disease, right? Because it leaves these marks on you, right? And of course, the fatality rate was enormous. I mean, it was just a fatal, absolutely fatal, right? That there you that it, when these sort of things happen, there was no real understanding, even in Europe, of course, of why it happened. Our understanding of this has changed dramatically because even at the time of the bubonic plague and the influenza epidemic, the idea was that it's actually lack of fresh air, for example, which contributes as well. The miasma theory, okay, uh, in part to these kinds of diseases. So if you look at Florence Nightingale in her book Notes on Nursing, one of the things that she points out is that, when you have a patient in a hospital, the first thing to do is to ensure that the person has fresh air. That's going to really help. There was no real understanding at that time of the nature of these kinds of epidemic disease. So the answer to your question, strictly speaking, is that yes, there are certainly scattered references here and there, but we don't really have any detailed accounts, from early Indian texts. But even in the West, there are some great writers. For example, in Athens, there is a plague that took place at the time of Pericles during the Peloponnesian War, as it's called, the 4th century BCE. And Thucydides, the great historian, wrote about this plague, right? And he tells you what the behavior of people is as a consequence of the plague. But there's no real, what you would call scientific or medical account of what exactly this was happening at that point in time, right? But my summation would be very simply, if you think about the answer I gave to the previous question, right? Um, that you see, this uh, article that I was talking about, published in this journal in 1870, and admits that the incidence and the frequency and the severity of famines has grown enormously under colonial rule. Okay, and says that there is comparatively very little evidence of famines of this scope happening during the Mughal period. It says that very clearly, 1870. An article published in a major journal in the United Kingdom itself. Okay, right? Now, similarly, I'm saying to you that it's not that, of course, that epidemic disease, that the colonial states' policies towards epidemic disease, that there was something really wanting in that. Well, there's something, even today, if you look at the coronavirus, you see different countries have handled it differently, right? The countries have handled the pandemic differently. Why does Brazil have such a high number of fatalities? Well, partly because of the policies that were pursued. So the real question would be whether under the Mughals, the policies that were pursued aggravated, let's say, the problem of epidemic disease or not. And there the answer at this point would be we don't know enough.
Right.
We don't know enough. I don't think that there's enough work or even probably enough data available to be able to say that. Uh, Again,
Yeah. Yes.
I'm not a specialist in Mughal history as such, although I've read widely in it, but at least I haven't seen anything that would suggest that we could answer that question.
So we have a references of Mongol Empire, how it fall. So one of the reason was plague. So plague
Yes.
spread all over. So like Mongol were connected with Mughals, so quite possible that they might have got it from.
Yes, but these are, these are real conjectures. There is now a serious revision of even the work that is being done on the Mongols and what is the nature of the Mongols, because you see, traditionally people have divided, um, if we might say, conquering empires into those such as the Mongols, who are viewed as nomadic,
Right.
and nomadic people are viewed, the Mongols here are viewed as people who came without any sense of real administrative structures, right?
Right.
Okay, well, that view is being now revised.
Right.
It's there's serious work on that. Um, but so therefore, exactly what we can say about the Mongols, and then particularly with respect to the question of whether the Mongol Empire fell because of the plague, and therefore that might tell us something about the Mughals. I think we'd have to establish these links much more closely, and I'm not prepared to say much about it because I haven't looked into those links, if there are any, uh, at this point in time.
Right. Pepys account by the late 17th century, more than 1 lakh Londoners, around one fourth of the city population died due to the plague.
Yes.
From where did the plague arrived in England, and had Britishers brought plague in India?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you're referring to the diary of Samuel Pepys. It's
Yes,
actually pronounced Pepys.
yes,
It's written as Pepys, but it's pronounced as Pepys.
yes,
So you're referring to his diary because we have fortuitously this very detailed diary, um, uh, of life in London uh, in the mid 1600s, written by a man who was well educated for his time, and it's a huge work. Now, of course, only a minuscule amount of it is devoted to the plague because he saw what was happening. So, first question is, where did it arrive from? Well, that's a that's a question that everyone wants to know. And think of this right now: where did the coronavirus come from? Okay, then you say it came from China. All right. Of course, the Chinese are not fully willing to accept that. Uh, and within that, then there is now a question about, well, is it actually a zoonotic disease, that it was simply leaped from animals to humans? But you know that there is a competing theory which initially had been rejected. Now some scientists are looking at it a bit more carefully, and the WHO has announced that it's going to look at it. This is the lab theory, that the virus was actually developed in a lab in Wuhan and it escaped from there. Okay. You see, what I'm trying to suggest is this, that this is not just a scientific question, it's a political question. Where did it come from? Because peeps will tell you that, uh, we heard the news coming from Amsterdam. So that, you see, what he's saying here is it's already happened in Amsterdam, and now it looks like it's coming here. Okay, but this is a very old habit of human beings and human societies. The worst problem always comes from somewhere else, and I have a discussion of that because the same thing happened with syphilis. Uh, I'm just randomly uh, uh, going to put it this way because it's randomly meaning, if you ask the Italians, well, where did syphilis come from, they'll tell you, oh, it's the Spaniards who brought it. If you ask the Spanish, where did the syphilis come from, they'll tell you the Dutch, it came from Holland. If you ask the people from Holland, the Netherlands, where did it come from, they'll tell you the Germans. And you ask the Germans will tell you it came from the Italians, right? That's what I mean. That there are specific accounts which say that each group of people thinks it comes from somewhere else. It never comes from within, right? So the question of where the Black Death came from is a political question, historically speaking, and we know that all of these actually moved on ship,
Yeah.
right? The bubonic plague also comes to India from the sea because it comes from rats on a ship, and that is probably what happened with the case of the Black uh, Death, and that's probably what happened with the bubonic plague
Right.
uh, at the
It
time of
started in
Samuel.
Bombay. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is really the answer to your question, twofold. One, that yes, you can say that it comes, let's say, on a ship where you have rats are carrying it. The ship docks and it gets transferred, as it were. The other answer is that we can never be sure because this is a political question
Right.
to some degree. Okay, where it comes from. That was the question that you had asked, and that really, in my view, the best answer one can give.
Sweden was criticized for not having timely lockdown, and India is criticized for having stringent lockdown.
Yeah.
What would be the perfect way to contain a pandemic like COVID-19 if we
Yeah.
draw inferences from the past?
Yes. Well, number one, I don't think that in this case we can draw too many inferences from the past. Let me begin in a more general way. Once again, you've given the example of Sweden and you've given the example of India, and you've quite rightly pointed out that India has been criticized for too stringent a lockdown, and Sweden has been criticized for the opposite reason, for effectively not having a lockdown, right? Um, Now, before we get to the case of Sweden and India, we can also bring in a couple of other countries. We can bring in the US, we can bring New Zealand into the picture, just so that we have a better idea of what's involved here. But before we do that, I just want to make a general observation because your question was what lessons, right, can we draw from the past? Correct?
Right.
Uh, in my view, there are too many people who have written books, such as Will Durant's book was actually called. Will Durant was someone who popularized history in the U.S. And he wrote this huge 10-volume work, The Age of Napoleon, The Age of Greece, that kind of thing, right? A compendium of human civilization. But he wrote a book called The Lessons of History. A lot of people like to talk about the lessons of history. Uh, I think that somehow uh, most human beings and human societies seem determined to reinvent the wheel. That is, that I'm not sure that people actually draw too many lessons from the past. There seems to be a persistence in human behavior in this respect that you know what happened in the past, and then somehow you just go about doing what you want to do. That happens with people on an individual level, and it happens with societies. All right. Um, Now, moving specifically to the the case of Sweden and India, and what can we, you know, is there something to learn? Well, if we wanted to learn, so I had given you an example that in the influenza epidemic of 1918, uh, which goes on for several years, and at least until 1920, it's very, very severe, and it has several waves. That in the United States, and I have a discussion of that in my book, we have examples of contrasting cities. Cities which decided to impose a lockdown and cities that decided they wouldn't do that. And the outcome was quite different. The outcome was quite different. Now we see that in the present uh, coronavirus pandemic, right? New Zealand probably is the country that has imposed the most stringent measures over a long period of time, meaning from the time that it started until the present day. Because look, what is the country that New Zealand has the closest relationship to? Australia.
Australia.
Okay, Australia. So one country that they are going to have a softer policy towards is Australia. That is that when they would permit no one else, they might permit Australians. Now, for example, they're not even permitting Australians. This has happened before because in Australia cases have risen. New Zealand is determined to try to escape what is happening at the present moment around the world with the Delta variant. Okay, right, where cases have risen dramatically. So New Zealand actually, India imposed a very strong, strict lockdown on March 24th of last year. I'll get to that in a moment. But remember that, okay, it's extended. Initially, it was for 2, 3 weeks, then it's extended, but eventually it's lifted. New Zealand, and then even after a period of time, people have started coming and going. I know people firsthand who have gone to India in recent months, for example. Okay, so India has relaxed it, and then again, when the second wave hit India really badly a few months ago, then again they imposed various measures. This is not how New Zealand did it. New Zealand basically has been consistent in holding to a very, very strict, not simply lockdown, actually, a strict policy to preserve the integrity of its borders from the virus. But this is a big but here. New Zealand's case cannot be very useful for the rest of the world, if you ask me. It cannot be for a large number of reasons, which we cannot discuss at length here, but they're partly mentioned in the book. It is a country that is relatively isolated and cut off from the rest of the world. Okay, it's relatively isolated and cut off. Uh, it's in the antipodes. It's miles away from anywhere else. Number two, the population is very small. Population. I mean, all of New Zealand is not even half the half the size or one third. It's one third the size of New Delhi in terms of population. In terms of land, it's huge. Okay, so the density of population in New Zealand is so low that it cannot even be imagined anywhere in India except in the remoter parts of the Himalayas, if you ask me.
Right.
Okay? Yeah. All right. You cannot really, in that sense, compare New Zealand to, let's say, India or China, the United States, and so on. Now, Sweden's case is a little more complicated, and I have a discussion of that because usually Sweden is seen in relationship to the other Nordic or Scandinavian countries. So usually you see it in relationship to when you compare data. And when people talk about the Scandinavian countries, then they're referring to, of course, not just Sweden, but they're also referring to Denmark, Norway, Finland, right? Okay, right? So there we find that Sweden took a very different path than Denmark, Norway, and Finland. It took a different path because those other countries decided that they were actually going to impose a lockdown. They were going to have strict border controls as well. Um, Sweden decided not to impose it. All right. Um, I don't think we should dismiss the Swedish experiment completely, but I'm not necessarily endorsing it, but I think we should think about it. Okay, and this book of mine is really an invitation to think about these issues. It's not giving decisive answers because I don't think there are any. Why should we think about it? Because in Sweden the approach was that a lockdown is is something that is uh, inimical to the spirit of our people. Now, let's be very clear what this means because we heard the same argument in America and in Britain. Oh, we can't have a lockdown. In fact, Boris Johnson, and the English said, oh no, we can't have a lockdown because one great part of our culture is, you go and drink beer with your mates at an English pub, and we won't be able to do that anymore. So, freedom is the very essence of being English and so on. Okay. Now, is Sweden saying really the same thing? Well, you see, Sweden, to understand why it did what it did, we'd have to look at a number of factors which I explain in the book, and therefore I won't discuss them at this moment. But its history is a little bit different. from the history of the other Scandinavian countries. Sweden is also a country that takes pride in a number of its brand, names, if I may put it this way, that have become part of world culture. Um, and in Sweden, the idea was that if we don't have a lockdown, but if we use our common sense, all right. So you see, but common sense is something that is socially constructed. The common sense of one culture and the common sense of another culture may be quite different about it. In Sweden, the common sense the prime minister wanted to argue is based on the idea that people understand that, hey, we have this disease, epidemic disease, okay, and people can catch the virus from someone else, they can get infected. And in order for that to not happen, we have to exercise some elementary cautions. Everyone should observe a certain kind of social distancing, right? These are the protocols that must happen. And by the way, there is no minimum consensus on these protocols in the United States, that which is one reason you have a problem here. Okay. So in Sweden, what happened was that actually the mortality rate was substantially higher than it was in Denmark, Norway, and Finland. The, okay, substantially. We're talking about, I mean, if I remember correctly from the data that I looked at and which I reported in my book, let's say about 4 times higher number of deaths proportionately in Sweden in comparison to these other countries. Well, but of course, people throughout this pandemic in Sweden had the freedom to move around, okay, to live their lives as they had largely lived them before. Um, and the question here is, was Sweden trying to strike some kind of balance and saying that, well, there are certain patterns in a society's culture which should not be disrupted. Okay. And I'm not saying I endorse that view, but I think that we need to be thoughtful about how we think about these these matters. You see.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Moving ahead, India saw the heart-wrenching migrant labor crisis during the
Yeah.
lockdown. Similar labor exodus from big cities happened during the plague too. Why
Yeah.
are we not able to learn from history?
Well, I anticipated that question, right? This idea of lessons from history. You see, we need a philosophical answer. We can take hundreds and thousands of examples and say where people quote learn and where they don't learn. I think I want to give a philosophical answer to that, which is that I think that look, um, you know, each generation there are a number of elements to it. See, each generation has to find its own feet itself. Okay, find its feet on the ground, I should say, itself. All right. Uh, the experience of others will not stand in for that. That seems to be very much a part of how human beings think and act. Now, of course, we would like to believe that, well, if there is a past, that something, quote, can be learned from it.
Right.
Okay. Um, but it's the same with so many institutions and practices. I mean, if you look at punishment, there is what is one of the favorite theories behind punishment? It's the deterrence theory. That that when you punish someone for something and you say, well, look, if you commit such a crime, you get 10 years in jail. This will deter others from carrying out that crime. That's the deterrence theory. Well, does it? You know, well, perhaps it's deterred some, and perhaps obviously it hasn't deterred others. And then, of course, there's this whole element of risk taking. That is this intrinsic to who we are, that sometimes we like to take risks. Why every cigarette package carries a warning that smoking is fatal to your health. It can cause death, lung disease. Well, that doesn't stop many smokers from smoking,
Right.
right? Why don't they learn what are have why do why it's the same thing, right? Why don't people actually learn from these things? And so therefore I think we'll have to ask different sets of questions, on when do we choose to learn and when do we choose not to learn. What does it really mean to learn? What is the nature of experience? How important is experience to self understanding, for example, right? And so on. There's a large number of questions that we will really have to, I think, learn, think about here. Okay. But I want to just go back to the question in a different way, because the question was the migrant crisis. And here I think there is another answer. And that answer is that we're really speaking about a government in India where people who run the government, we're not naming names, but we're just saying in general, the general outlook of this government, this is not a government of people who are educated, frankly, and in what I would call the real sense of the term, educated. Right? These are not people who really have, for them, knowing the past means, knowing that we had a great culture, they'd like to imagine these things. Hindustan has had a great culture, glorious culture. We have the Ramayana, we have the Mahabharata, we have this, we have that. For them, that's what the past means, right? How many people in the government were aware? They didn't even have to know about what happened in the bubonic plague of 1896, because the Indian Plague Commission, and I mentioned that very clearly, that even at that time, what was the first thing? The cities emptied out, right? The cities emptied out. People went back. This is back, we're talking about 1896 epidemic, okay? And then the same thing happened 25 years ago when plague struck the city of Surat. That's 25 years ago. That's within the living memory of everyone who's in the Indian government today. And what happened in Surat, right? That the city virtually emptied out, half the population fled. This is historically how people in India have responded. When you have a calamity or when you have some form of oppression, right? So taxation. When taxation, the state imposes taxes which people are not in a position to pay. For example, let's suppose you have a certain tax, land revenue, and then there's a drought, people aren't able to pay, right? But the state still wants to impose that same land revenue, even though people are not in a position to pay. So how do peasants respond historically in India? They respond with their feet. They leave the village. It's a strategy. During the whole non-violent movement that we had under Gandhi, during the civil disobedience movement, the Bardoli Satyagraha. Okay, you see, if there were people who were educated in the government who understood how these things work, they would have anticipated. They would have anticipated that when you impose a lockdown of this kind, because look, if you look at the migrant laborers, a lot of these people, you've seen that all over India. These are people who are working for minimum bottom wages, rock bottom wages. Many of these men don't have even actually a small hut or roof under which they actually sleep in the factory itself. They sleep in the factory. Some of them will actually sleep in the truck. You know. Okay. Now, when you impose a strict lockdown and say you can't even go out of the street, well, what are these people going to do? So the instinct immediately was you go back to the village. The village is where the soul is, so to speak, of India. Right? But it's not even so much as saying, oh, what are the lessons of the past and why don't we learn the lessons? In the government, there's hardly anyone who even knows these things. They don't have advisors who can say, well, this is what happened in Surat. Let's try to understand what the implications of this policy might be. Just look at what happened in Surat. And Bardoli Satyagraha was a no tax campaign, okay, 2 years before the Salt March 1928. And the way in which the villagers decided to respond to excessive taxation was they just completely abandoned the villages, took all their cows with them. There we have detailed accounts of this. So there's plenty of precedents for this kind of migration in India. Plenty of precedents. The scale of this is much larger now. And there are very interesting questions that arise from this, because the history of India post 1947 is the migration of people from villages to the city. That's how cities have grown.
Right.
Here we had a reverse migration.
Yeah.
Reverse migration. People going from the cities, from urban areas, back into the countryside. Yeah.
How did COVID-19 change politics and our society?
Huge question. It's a very, very big question. How did COVID-19 change politics? Well, it's too early to tell how exactly it would have changed things and to what extent it has changed them. But we can take a few examples. Okay, the first main concern I think everyone should uh, think about is whether the coronavirus pandemic has strengthened the state relative to civil society. That is, has the coronavirus pandemic given the state the opportunity, the pretext to acquire more powers of surveillance, powers of control of your mobility, right? And I think the answer, unfortunately, is that it has in most countries, including India. That is the first. So I said it's too early to answer. Um, that is in the long scheme of things. We'll have to see how all of it works out. But if I look at the last 18 months, then I can say that has been the first major consequence of the pandemic. Okay. So in India, let's be frank about it. For example, you had the Shaheen Bagh movement.
Yes.
Now, this is a remarkable movement. The government had been able to do almost, frankly, very little to put it down. And there were many Shaheen Baghs, as they were called, as you know, that sprung up all over the country. Okay. But when the pandemic happened, overnight, they finished it overnight. Because remember that the prime minister announced the lockdown, gave basically 4 hours to the country, 4 hours notice to the country, right? And it comes into effect on midnight. And that same night, the police came, Delhi police came, they removed all the murals, all the tent that had been in in the middle of the road, right? They came, they removed all of that. They painted over all the murals, removed all the posters, just completely took down everything. What they had not been able to, the pandemic provided the best pretext. Okay, and there are instances of this from many other countries. So the powers of the state have grown. Number two, um, this is again related to the state, but in a different way. That in some countries there is now a realization, particularly countries such as the United States, countries that is where you have a belief that the state role should be kept to a minimum, okay? Where there is a profound suspicion of the state, let's say. All right. I think even in these countries, there is now a realization that only the state can play a role in something of this kind. This is something that cannot be handled by free enterprise. In every single country of the world, it was a state that took over the responsibility. How well it executed the responsibility is a different matter. But in every single country, it became very clear that this is not uh, something that private enterprise can handle. Okay, that is how. What do we do? What kind of policy do we have? And same thing with vaccinations. There is a profound suspicion of the state in the United States, in Australia, for example. But it's very clear that when you have to vaccinate the entire population or a large part of the population, okay, and you have to do it in a systematic fashion, and there has to be a record of this, and even the distribution of these vaccines, there has to be a state policy. So I think that we got to have to think about the role of the state here. Okay, and of course the role of the state comes in other ways too, because what the pandemic has revealed very clearly is that in most states the public health infrastructure is completely inadequate. If the public health infrastructure had been a lot better in a country like India, the second wave, the way it happened, it was just gruesome. It was it was gruesome, and it was a complete collapse of the public health infrastructure and of the state there. You see, so now I'm arguing something different now, because let's take the case of India. What did we see? What we saw here was desperate messages that were sent by the hundreds of thousands. Desperate messages sent by people saying, yeah, oxygen cylinder nahi, I don't have an oxygen cylinder, I need an oxygen cylinder, my mother is dying, or my aunt is dying, or my child is dying, or is severely ill. Um, and and they were sending these messages through social media, on Twitter, on Instagram, Facebook, correct? We all know that, right? And we know that individuals came forward to help. So the other thing we have learned from this, so to speak, to go back to lessons, but it's not really lessons here. The other thing we have become aware of is that no matter how efficient a state is, and unfortunately, most states have shown themselves to be completely inefficient, actually. But even if a state is really efficient, no matter how efficient it is, that can never replace completely. Okay, it can never replace individual entrepreneurship, autonomy. It cannot replace the the bonds of sociality between human beings. That is, that the state may have a very good policy, but that will not excuse individuals from doing what they must do to help someone at a time of distress. So the best managed state can never replace a certain kind of notion of compassion and dignity and humanity, which is the only way we can actually get through a pandemic of this kind. Yeah.
Yeah. Who is responsible for COVID-19? Is it WHO or China or rest of the world together?
No, well, you see that's so. I had kind of somewhat anticipated that, right? Because who is responsible? Is it China? Is it WHO? Well, I think China definitely has some role to play. That's my own view of the matter. But that's, you know, I mean, I've put it some role to play. Meaning here that I think it is quite likely that the virus actually did originate in China. I think it's a zoonotic disease. But look, why did it happen? We'll have to understand that to answer your question. Because what's happening is human beings are increasingly encroaching upon natural preserves. Okay. Now, if that's the case, then the world bears responsibility. It is our lifestyles. It's our modern lifestyles. It's the levels of consumption that we all want, right? Right? Then it's not simply the responsibility of China. And I think we have to be very careful when we say it's a responsibility of this or that country, because that uh, does unquestionably lead people to, uh, it incites them. It incites them to hatred um, for another country. And that is why you had extreme anti-Chinese sentiments in many countries, India included. Okay, India, United States, Australia, many countries reported incidents of violence against people of Chinese origin or people who look Chinese, whether they were of Chinese origin or not. If they look Chinese, quote, you know, they were people from Northeast India who were attacked and who were mocked for being Chinese, which right. So there can be consequences when we say that, oh, the virus came from such and such place, because ultimately, you see, it has to do with the nature of modern life. It has to do with the fact that uh, none of us is willing to put constraints on our own behavior. Uh, Unchecked consumption is the law everywhere, so to speak. People traveling back and forth, increasing the carbon footprint incredibly, right? So, to that extent, everyone is. But this doesn't mean that China doesn't have a role, that the WHO, how did the WHO handle it? Well, that's a long story. And again, I have a chapter on that, as you know, in the book, where I look specifically at the WHO. Um, I think that, look, when you have an organization of that kind, uh, you're going to always have some organizational failures. It's going to happen. I think the main point about WHO that I would like to make is this: the WHO was set up at a time when the challenges to the scientific community, to the medical community, were different than they are now to some substantial degree. WHO was set up at a time when they were not thinking about zoonotic diseases at all. They were thinking about such things as smallpox and polio. Okay. And so now I think that the WHO will have to be reconfigured to think about how an international organization of this kind, which is charged with taking care of international medical emergencies, right? How it must be reconfigured to reflect the realities of today. That's the organization is not completely obsolete, but it is somewhat obsolete in that sense.
So one last question. What's your future plan? Are you writing something?
Oh, I write in many things. Yeah, I'm just finishing a book. Just finished it actually, but I'm now revising the draft. It's a book on uh, the uh, the artist and insurgency. It's okay. So it's a book on how Indian artists at that time responded to the freedom struggle. Okay, so we know what you know what Bose did, what Bose stood for, the role of Gandhi, of course. People have heard of major nationalist figures, but what was the role of art? How did artists respond? What kind of, did it produce any art? Does the art give us a narrative? So basically, this book looks at Indian art, not contemporary art, not looking back today or even 20 years ago. For example, lots of artists have done paintings on the Sword March, right? Lots of them. Um, but much of this work is from the last 15, 20 years. But what about at that time itself? How were artists responding in 1930, 1931 to the Salt Satyagraha, uh, to Jallianwala Bagh massacre, to Quit India movement, to Gandhi's constructive program. You know, so that's I've just finished that, and then I've um, doing a I put together. I'm putting together. I've got 40 published papers on Gandhi. Some very lengthy scholarly pieces. Some of them are much shorter pieces, but I'm putting them together in a two-volume collection for Orient Black Swan. And the other thing I'm working on all of these things simultaneously, is there is a man called Reverend James M. Lawson, uh, not known to anyone in India. He should be. He's the last of the great living figures from the American civil rights movement. He's now 93 years old, lives in Los Angeles. I know him very well. And uh, we had 13 very long conversations a few years ago, a total of 27 hours, which I recorded. And so these are being edited, and a book will come out from this next year. So he also lived in India from 1953 to 56. One of the greatest practitioners of nonviolence and the tradition of Gandhi in the world over the last several decades. That's who he is, Reverend James M. Lawson. Yeah. So that's one of the other things I'm working on right now. Yeah.
Yeah. So we would love to have you a discussion on your upcoming book, if time permits and if you have time.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So thanks for your time, Vinay. So it was lovely discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure. Okay. Bye bye. Yeah. Namaste.
Hopefully, you liked this episode. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.